He was a highly ruthless multi-millionaire CEO who arrogantly abandoned his secret pregnant girlfriend to aggressively build a massive corporate empire completely in London. Exactly 3 agonizing years later, he confidently boarded a highly luxurious first-class flight, absolutely, blissfully unaware that sitting heavily in cheap economy was the exact woman he had violently abandoned, fiercely holding the hands of his biological, identical twins. Welcome back, my beautiful family. If you fiercely love highly explosive stories about massive karma, brutal betrayals, and the absolute ultimate power of a mother's unbreakable love, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do if you ran into your toxic ex on a massive airplane in the comments below. Let's get directly into the Christmas Eve flight. The Christmas Eve flight, echoes of the past, massive destiny, actively possessed a highly calculated, terrifying plan completely for this specific Christmas Eve. A highly bustling, chaotic airport, a highly exhausted, struggling single mother, and an incredibly ruthless, arrogant businessman, completely with a freezing heart, entirely of solid iron. Exactly what violently happens. Exactly when the absolute, brutal truth intensely looks directly into your piercing eyes completely at exactly 30,000 massive feet entirely in the freezing air. The highly massive Madrid-Barajas International Airport violently vibrated completely with the highly electric, frantic energy entirely of Christmas Eve. Completely among the highly massive tide entirely of highly stressed travelers, heavily burdened, completely with thick scarves and heavy suitcases. Valeria Reyes, exactly 26 young years old, desperately attempted to flawlessly maintain her highly fragile calm, exactly as she heavily carried a highly massive, cheap backpack and fiercely watched her highly energetic, exactly 2.5-year-old biological twins, Mateo and Luna. Her highly dark, beautiful brown hair beautifully fell entirely in highly careless, messy waves, perfectly over a beautiful face that entirely, despite the massive, crushing exhaustion, flawlessly conserved a highly serene beauty and an absolute, unbreakable determination. Mateo, do absolutely not violently let completely go entirely of the cheap stroller. Luna, my beautiful darling, fiercely give me your tiny hand, Valeria softly whispered completely, with a highly gentle but incredibly firm voice. Valeria was an absolute, highly complex woman, entirely of massive contrasts. A highly dedicated nurse, completely by elite profession, and a highly fierce, absolute lioness, completely by pure instinct. Her piercing green eyes, beautifully inherited completely from her loving grandmother, aggressively scanned the highly crowded boarding lounge, frantically searching completely for the highly specific departure gate directly to Sevilla. On her soft right wrist, she flawlessly wore a highly simple, cheap silver bracelet, beautifully engraved, completely with exactly 2 tiny hearts and the highly beautiful names entirely of her innocent children. It was her absolute, highly powerful amulet, completely against highly toxic loneliness. This was officially the absolute first time she was actively taking the innocent children to safely meet her highly traditional Andalusian family, and the absolute first time she generously permitted completely herself to safely return directly to the massive city exactly where her fragile heart had violently been brutally shattered, completely into a million microscopic pieces. Flight IBE-24, directly destined completely for Sevilla. Highly immediate massive boarding entirely through Gate B-18. the highly metallic robotic voice loudly announced completely over the heavy speakers. Valeria took a massive, incredibly deep breath. The identical twins were the absolute living portrait entirely of a highly arrogant man, who absolutely no longer legally formed absolutely any part entirely of her beautiful world. Matteo flawlessly possessed that highly mischievous, bright smile that beautifully illuminated massive rooms. But the highly dark, incredibly profound eyes entirely of his biological father. Luna flawlessly possessed the highly rebellious, beautiful curls entirely of Valeria, but a highly analytical, incredibly determined gaze that highly agonizingly, painfully reminded her completely of him. Exactly what Valeria absolutely could not highly possibly suspect was that exactly a highly few short meters, completely away, entirely in the highly exclusive, elite first-class cabin, was officially sitting Julian de la Riva. At exactly 37 arrogant years old, Julian was the absolute perfect personification, entirely of highly freezing elite success. He was absolutely no longer the highly young, pathetic dreamer who brutally worked entirely in a highly modest, cheap office. Exactly now, he flawlessly wore highly expensive, bespoke Italian-tailored suits and aggressively radiated a highly terrifying aura, entirely of absolute authority, that violently intimidated his elite competitors. Julian had successfully, aggressively, built a highly massive technological empire completely between massive London and massive Madrid. But completely lately, the highly deafening silence entirely of his highly luxurious multi-million-dollar penthouses aggressively returned a highly toxic echo entirely of absolute, crushing emptiness. Christmas absolutely always violently brought completely with it highly terrifying ghosts, highly especially the beautiful ghost entirely of the exact beautiful woman he had violently, ruthlessly left completely behind, entirely to aggressively pursue a highly toxic ambition that exactly now physically felt completely, utterly sterile. The encounter in the clouds, Valeria was frantically finishing actively wrestling completely with the highly difficult seatbelts entirely of the energetic twins, completely in cheap seats 22A and 22B, entirely in the highly cramped economy class. At that exact, highly specific instant, completely by a highly cruel, toxic irony, entirely of massive destiny, Julian smoothly stood completely up entirely from his highly expensive plush leather seat, entirely in the absolute front, actively searching completely for a highly important corporate document entirely in his expensive briefcase. As he smoothly turned completely around, his piercing gaze aggressively swept completely down the highly narrow aisle, and completely, violently, stopped entirely on the highly exhausted woman, desperately attempting to successfully calm the highly loud crying entirely of a tiny little girl. The entire massive world completely, violently stopped. Valeria physically felt absolutely all the heavy oxygen violently abandon her burning lungs. It was absolutely him, Julian, significantly more highly mature, significantly more incredibly imposing, heavily surrounded completely by a highly elite elegance that violently screamed massive wealth completely from a highly safe distance. Julian, completely on his highly arrogant part, stood completely, utterly petrified. The beautiful woman he had secretly, fiercely loved entirely for exactly 3 agonizing years. The absolute one he violently lost entirely through his absolute own, highly pathetic cowardice, was actively sitting perfectly there. But she absolutely wasn't completely alone. There were exactly 2 innocent children. Innocent children who would highly accurately be exactly 3 years old. Matteo slowly looked completely up, and his highly dark, profound eyes violently collided completely with Julian's piercing ones. The terrifying multimillionaire physically felt a highly freezing, massive chill violently run completely down his strong spine. They were absolutely his exact own eyes. Valeria vividly saw exactly how a highly terrifying pallor violently covered Julian's handsome face, exactly as absolute, highly terrifying comprehension miraculously dawned completely in his piercing gaze. The highly toxic, massive secret she had fiercely, successfully guarded completely, with bright blood, thick sweat, and hot tears entirely, for exactly 1,000 agonizing days, had literally, just violently, highly explosively detonated completely in absolute mid-flight. "Hello, Julian," she whispered incredibly softly, her beautiful voice violently trembling exactly as Luna fiercely hugged her soft neck. The heavy doors entirely of the massive airplane violently sealed completely shut. For the absolute next 60 highly agonizing minutes, they would absolutely be completely, inescapably confined entirely in that massive metal tube, exactly thousands entirely of meters, completely in the freezing air. Completely with exactly 3 agonizing years, entirely of highly toxic lies, freezing silences, and an absolute pure love that absolutely never, ever truly managed to completely die, violently floating perfectly between them. Julian just discovered he has twins. If you were him, what would be your first reaction? Anger, joy, or guilt? Let us know below. The confession at 30,000 feet, the highly deafening, massive roar entirely of the heavy engines, was the absolute only sound that completely filled the highly tense space perfectly between them. Julian, completely, utterly incapable, entirely of safely returning directly to his highly comfortable, expensive leather seat, walked incredibly slowly directly toward row 22. His highly legendary, arrogant confidence had completely, utterly evaporated. Can we actively talk?" Julian asked completely, with a deep voice that Valeria could literally barely vividly recognize. They highly awkwardly moved completely toward the highly cramped, tiny space entirely of the rear galley, frantically searching completely for a highly minimal, pathetic privacy. "They are officially yours," Valeria stated firmly, completely before he could highly possibly articulate a single, pathetic word. "Matteo and Luna are officially your biological children, Julian." The highly absolute confirmation violently struck him exactly with the massive force entirely of a highly lethal lightning bolt. "Why exactly, Valeria? Why exactly didn't you absolutely ever actively seek me completely out?" "I fiercely sought you completely out," she violently exclaimed entirely in a highly desperate whisper, completely loaded entirely with massive pain. "I confidently went directly to your massive office, and they highly toxically told me that you had aggressively moved completely to massive London. I frantically called you, and your highly secure number was completely, permanently cancelled. Your highly arrogant elite assistant toxically treated me exactly like a highly pathetic stranger. I was exactly 4 agonizing months heavily pregnant, exactly when I fiercely decided that my innocent children absolutely did not highly deserve a highly pathetic father who maliciously considered them a highly toxic hindrance completely to his elite career. I was completely, utterly alone, Julian. Completely alone, and absolutely, blindly terrified, completely to death." Julian tightly closed his piercing eyes. physically feeling the massive, crushing weight entirely of absolutely every single highly catastrophic, erroneous decision. I violently lost exactly 3 agonizing years. I violently missed absolutely everything. Matteo beautifully learned exactly how to successfully walk loudly, calling entirely for a highly pathetic man who absolutely wasn't actively there. Valeria flawless sentenced completely with a highly bitter, toxic smile. Now, please, highly respectively return directly to your expensive seat. We actively possess a highly beautiful life entirely in Sevilla. And you absolutely possess a highly massive company to aggressively direct. Valeria rejected Julian's apology. Do you think he deserves a second chance, or is it too late? Tell us your thoughts. The weight of absence. The massive airplane smoothly landed entirely at the San Pablo airport, completely in Sevilla, directly under a highly warm, beautiful winter sun that beautifully bathed the massive runway. For Valeria, the highly smooth descent was a highly beautiful, safe return directly to the absolute security, entirely of her deep roots. For Julian, it was a highly terrifying descent, completely into a highly unfamiliar territory, exactly where his highly arrogant CEO titles and massive multi-billion-dollar bank accounts explicitly meant absolutely nothing. As they confidently walked completely through the highly busy terminal, Julian aggressively followed Valeria exactly a highly few short meters completely behind, completely with his massive heart violently hammering entirely against his fragile ribs. He intensely observed exactly how she highly efficiently managed the cheap stroller, exactly how Matteo enthusiastically pointed directly at the massive airplanes, and exactly how Luna highly exhaustedly rubbed her beautiful eyes entirely from the highly tiring trip. They were officially his biological blood. Every single highly tiny gesture entirely of Matteo. Every single piercing look entirely of Luna was highly absolute, living proof entirely of exactly what he had highly toxically ignored entirely to aggressively pursue highly pathetic, fake shadows entirely of toxic success, completely abroad. Valeria, wait, Julian softly called, completely near the busy baggage claim area. Generously let me safely take you. I officially possess a highly armored luxury car actively waiting. Valeria completely stopped and intensely looked directly at him, completely with a highly profound serenity that violently hurt him significantly more than a highly loud scream. No, Julian. My loving grandmother will actively come directly to safely pick us completely up. We absolutely do not desperately need your highly toxic luxuries. I absolutely already explicitly told you. We have successfully, beautifully, learned exactly how to flawlessly move completely alone. Please, he pathetically pleaded, his deep voice a highly fragile thread entirely of absolute vulnerability. I absolutely only desperately want to explicitly know exactly where you are actively going to be. I desperately want to flawlessly ensure that you safely arrive completely fine. Before Valeria could successfully respond, a highly loud, incredibly clear voice violently resonated completely in the busy hall. Valeria, my beautiful children! Doña Sofia, Valeria's highly traditional, loving grandmother, was confidently approaching completely with highly wide, open arms. At her highly advanced age, she flawlessly conserved the absolute, highly elegant elegance entirely of Andalusian women, and the exact same, highly piercing green eyes entirely of Valeria, highly completely capable, entirely of deeply reading the absolute soul entirely of absolutely anyone. But exactly upon vividly seeing the highly elegant, massive man who was confidently standing perfectly next, completely to her beautiful granddaughter, she completely, violently, stopped entirely dead in her tracks. Doña Sofia profoundly knew that highly handsome face incredibly well, completely, from the highly old, torn photos that Valeria absolutely never, ever possessed the highly absolute courage to violently burn. "Is it officially him?" Sofia sharply asked, her beautiful voice completely, violently, losing absolutely all its pure warmth and rapidly turning completely into a highly lethal warning. Is exactly this the highly pathetic gentleman who conveniently, highly toxically, forgot that he officially possessed a beautiful family entirely in Spain, completely, while he aggressively made himself incredibly rich entirely in massive London? Julian confidently took exactly one massive step completely forward, heavily bowing his massive head. "Ma'am, I absolutely did not completely know." Absolutely not completely knowing is absolutely not a highly valid excuse, young man, Sofia flawlessly sentenced, intensely measuring Julian completely from top entirely to bottom. Blinding hunger absolutely does not patiently wait entirely for absolutely someone to eventually know. The freezing cold entirely of the highly terrifying fever nights entirely of these innocent children absolutely did not patiently wait entirely for you to highly arrogantly decide to finally return. If you were Julian facing the angry grandmother, what would you say to prove your remorse is genuine? Tell us your strategy. The shadow of London, despite the highly vehement protests entirely of Valeria, massive destiny, or perhaps the highly intense curiosity entirely of Sofia to explicitly see if the highly arrogant man possessed absolutely any microscopic ounce entirely of pure decency, generously permitted Julian to aggressively follow her completely in his luxury car, directly to the highly traditional neighborhood entirely of Triana. Sofia's beautiful house was incredibly small, completely filled entirely with highly beautiful flower pots, highly old family photos, and the highly delicious, intoxicating aroma entirely of sweet cinnamon and hot chocolate. An absolute, highly stark contrast completely to the highly sterile, 5-star luxury hotels, exactly where Julian absolutely, usually highly comfortably stayed. Inside the highly warm house, Matteo and Luna profoundly felt incredibly comfortable completely immediately, enthusiastically running directly toward their highly old, cheap toys that Sofia had fiercely guarded exactly like highly priceless treasures. Julian remained standing perfectly still, entirely in the highly narrow threshold, entirely of the small living room, profoundly feeling exactly like a highly massive, clumsy giant, entirely in a highly fragile world, entirely of delicate crystal. "Matteo brutally works incredibly much," little Matteo stated, confidently approaching Julian completely with a highly cheap plastic toy car. "Mom explicitly says that highly occasionally you violently cry entirely because you are incredibly exhausted," he innocently added, intensely looking directly at Valeria. Julian physically felt a highly sharp, lethal stab, entirely of toxic guilt, while he was highly enthusiastically celebrating highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar contracts completely with expensive champagne. Valeria was violently crying entirely from pure, unadulterated exhaustion, fiercely raising his biological children completely, utterly alone. "I am so incredibly, profoundly sorry, Valeria," Julian whispered incredibly softly, exactly when Sofia had highly safely taken the young children directly to the busy kitchen. I have absolutely been a highly toxic, pathetic fool. I arrogantly thought that massive success was exactly this. He highly vaguely gestured completely at his expensive bespoke suit. But absolute true success was exactly what you actively possess completely right here. Exactly what he officially possesses is absolute peace, Julian, she firmly replied. And you are an absolute violent storm. You absolutely cannot confidently waltz completely in here. Highly pathetically play loving dad completely for exactly one short Christmas, and then violently disappear completely exactly when massive London highly arrogantly calls you completely again. I will absolutely not generously let you violently shatter the fragile hearts entirely of my innocent children. Exactly like you, violently shattered, absolutely mine. I am absolutely not actively going to violently disappear, he stated completely with highly absolute firmness. I have fiercely decided to completely, permanently move my highly massive base entirely of elite operations directly to massive Madrid. I will absolutely be exactly 2 short hours, completely away, entirely from exactly here. I desperately want to actively be a highly real, true father. Valeria. Absolutely not a highly pathetic ATM machine, but a true father who happily reads bedtime stories and lovingly cures painful scraped knees. Just exactly when the highly tense atmosphere visually seemed to beautifully soften, Julian's expensive phone violently vibrated. It was a highly toxic, urgent message completely from Veronica. His highly ruthless corporate partner and highly toxic ex-fiancée, entirely in massive London. A highly terrifying woman who absolutely did not easily accept a highly definitive no entirely for a pathetic answer, and who had literally just aggressively landed completely in massive Sevilla, frantically searching completely for her highly errant, massive partner. The ultimatum, the highly warm afternoon sun, beautifully filtered completely through the cheap blinds entirely of Doña Sofia's cozy house, flawlessly creating a highly beautiful atmosphere entirely of pure calm that was brutally, violently interrupted completely by the highly loud, arrogant sound entirely of a highly expensive, massive luxury engine, violently parking directly in front entirely of the highly modest blue door. Julian completely, violently, paled exactly upon vividly recognizing the highly expensive vehicle. It absolutely wasn't a highly pathetic coincidence. Veronica Santander, his highly elite partner, and the exact, highly toxic woman, completely with whom the entire, massive corporate world highly arrogantly expected him to seamlessly marry, had aggressively followed his highly secret trail. Veronica confidently stepped completely out, entirely of the massive luxury car, exactly as if she were highly arrogantly strutting completely down a highly exclusive Milan fashion runway, completely with her highly expensive, dark sunglasses and a highly luxurious cashmere coat. She confidently walked directly toward the highly modest entrance entirely of the highly simple Triana house. Valeria, who was actively, peacefully serving hot tea, vividly saw the highly terrifying expression entirely of pure terror completely on Julian's handsome face, and she profoundly knew that the beautiful peace was permanently over. Julian, my darling, what exactly is this highly quaint, pathetic little place? Veronica highly arrogantly asked, exactly upon confidently entering completely, without absolutely even politely asking entirely for absolute permission. Her piercing eyes aggressively scanned the small room completely, with highly poorly disguised, toxic disdain, violently stopping completely on Valeria and the innocent twins, happily playing entirely on the hard floor. Veronica, I explicitly told you that I completely, officially canceled absolutely all my massive plans. I actively possess a highly urgent, massive family matter, Julian replied, rapidly standing completely up and desperately attempting to violently block Veronica's highly toxic view directly toward the innocent children. Family matter. Veronica let out a highly freezing, toxic laugh. I absolutely did not completely know that you actively possessed highly pathetic relatives entirely in this highly poor, working-class neighborhood, and significantly much less, exactly how should I highly delicately say it, a highly pathetic friend, completely with highly annoying children. Valeria heavily placed the hot teapot completely on the small table, completely with a highly absolute firmness that actively made the cheap cups violently clatter. My exact name is officially Valeria Reyes, and this is officially the highly private house entirely of my loving grandmother. If you are actively looking entirely for Julian, completely for highly boring business, I genuinely think you have highly egregiously mistaken the highly specific date and the exact place. Today is officially Christmas Eve. Veronica aggressively removed her highly expensive sunglasses, flawlessly revealing piercing eyes, highly loaded completely with a highly dangerous, toxic ambition. She intensely looked directly at Mateo, and then directly at Julian. Veronica's highly sharp intelligence was exactly as incredibly sharp, exactly as her highly toxic tongue. It absolutely did not actively take her significantly more than exactly 5 short seconds entirely to flawlessly notice the highly astounding, undeniable resemblance completely between the innocent boy and her massive partner. Wow. Julian. So exactly, this was officially your highly pathetic little secret, Veronica violently hissed. The massive, highly arrogant Julian de la Riva, the highly terrifying man who absolutely possesses zero massive time entirely for pathetic vacations, apparently highly toxically left a highly messy loose end exactly 3 agonizing years completely ago. Do you profoundly know exactly what this highly toxic scandal will violently do completely to our highly pristine, massive corporate image? We are actively entirely about to successfully, flawlessly, close the highly massive €50 million merger completely with the highly strict German investors. You absolutely cannot afford a highly toxic scandal entirely of highly secret bastard children entirely in a highly pathetic, working-class neighborhood. That is absolutely enough, Veronica, Julian violently roared. My biological children are absolutely not a highly toxic scandal or a highly messy loose end. They are the absolute, most incredibly real, massive thing I have absolutely ever possessed entirely in my entire life. Do absolutely not actively talk completely to me entirely about highly pathetic reality, Veronica violently screamed. The absolute, brutal reality is the highly massive €50 million contract that we absolutely must formally sign entirely in massive New York, completely after the highly elite holidays. This highly pathetic, toxic fantasy entirely of actively being a highly loving father is actively going to violently cost you the entire, massive empire that we flawlessly built. Fiercely choose right exactly now. Either you actively, immediately, come completely with me directly to the luxury hotel entirely, to flawlessly prepare entirely for the massive meeting. Or tomorrow morning, the highly strict elite investors will profoundly know that their highly esteemed CEO has completely, violently lost his absolute mind, completely over a highly pathetic nurse entirely from Sevilla. Veronica is blackmailing Julian with a €50 million deal. What do you think Julian will choose, money or family? Tell us below, sacrifice or betrayal. The highly small, cozy living room entirely of Doña Sofia, completely in the highly modest Triana neighborhood, violently became incredibly, physically suffocating. The highly unexpected, toxic appearance entirely of Veronica was exactly like a highly freezing, bitter wind, completely from massive London, violently blowing completely into the highly warm, beautiful Christmas Eve night. Exactly there she confidently stood, aggressively gripping her highly expensive, elite designer handbag, exactly like a highly lethal weapon, completely with her piercing gaze entirely full, entirely of absolute toxic threat and massive disdain. Julian intensely looked directly at Valeria. She stood perfectly, incredibly straight, her piercing blue eyes brilliantly shining completely with massive pride, but absolutely also heavily containing a highly profound, deep disappointment. Her beautiful eyes actively seemed to highly loudly say, "Do you vividly see? Your highly toxic, massive world is absolutely not completely for my innocent children and for me. Julian, I absolutely do not possess the entire damn day. The highly armored car is aggressively waiting completely outside. Either you confidently leave, or I urgently call the massive senior partner right this exact second," Veronica violently growled, completely with her soft hand absolutely already aggressively hovering completely over her highly expensive, latest model smartphone. Julian intensely looked directly at Matteo and Luna. The exactly two innocent, poor children had completely stopped happily playing, deeply cowering completely with blinding fear directly behind their loving mother. Matteo fiercely clung completely to Valeria's highly simple shirt, his highly dark eyes, completely, flawlessly identical entirely to Julian's, intensely looked directly at him completely with a highly scrutinizing, highly terrified, completely unfamiliar gaze. Julian took a massive, incredibly deep breath. He intensely looked directly at the highly expensive, elite watch he flawlessly wore completely on his strong wrist. The absolute, undeniable symbol entirely of the highly toxic, massive success he had exactly once highly desperately, arrogantly craved. Then, he smoothly, highly decisively removed it and aggressively placed it highly firmly completely on the small wooden table. "Veronica, you can actively call absolutely whoever the hell you fiercely want. You can aggressively keep my massive shares, my highly luxurious elite office entirely in massive London, even the highly arrogant CEO title that you so highly desperately cherish. But you absolutely cannot violently take completely away exactly what I profoundly feel at this exact massive moment." Massive. Veronica stood completely, utterly stunned. "Are you completely violently insane? It is exactly 50 million euros, Julian. Are you actively going to violently throw them completely into the pathetic garbage, simply entirely for a highly pathetic error, completely from the highly toxic past?" Julian confidently approached incredibly closely, completely to Valeria. Absolutely, without ever actively looking completely back entirely at Veronica again. "This absolutely is not a highly pathetic error. It is my absolute, entire life. During the highly toxic, last 3 agonizing years, I have absolutely been a highly lonely, pathetic millionaire. Highly comfortably sleeping completely on a highly massive pile, entirely of cold money, but completely with my absolute soul, violently rotting completely inside. I violently missed the absolute first, highly precious steps entirely of my biological children. Their highly beautiful, absolute first calls entirely of Dad. I will absolutely not violently miss a single microscopic second, significantly more. Get the hell out, Veronica. That highly massive contract, safely consider it my highly generous Christmas gift entirely to you." Veronica violently gritted her perfectly white teeth, her beautiful face violently turning bright red, completely with pure, unadulterated anger. She aggressively spun completely on her highly expensive heels. The highly loud, sharp clatter entirely of her stilettos, completely on the hard wooden floor, actively sounding exactly like a highly toxic curse, completely before the heavy front door violently slammed completely shut. The highly massive luxury Mercedes rapidly sped completely away, entirely, at absolute top speed, flawlessly leaving completely behind it an absolute deafening silence. A handmade gift. Doña Sofia, who had absolutely been intensely, quietly observing completely from a highly quiet corner, slowly approached incredibly softly. She intensely looked directly at Julian, completely, with a highly completely different gaze. Absolutely no longer completely, with highly toxic hostility, but completely, with highly intense scrutiny, flawlessly mixed completely with a highly profound touch, entirely of absolute respect. Did you literally just violently throw completely away a highly massive fortune, young man? She softly asked entirely, in a highly low, quiet voice. I successfully kept my absolute, entire, massive world, ma'am, Julian softly replied, his deep voice incredibly hoarse, completely from massive, pure emotion. He smoothly knelt completely down entirely before Matteo and Luna. Dad highly profoundly apologizes entirely for confidently arriving incredibly late. I absolutely do not possess highly expensive, massive gifts, but I fiercely promise you that completely from exactly now, completely on, I will absolutely be the exact man who flawlessly fixes your broken toys, who happily tells you highly entertaining stories every single beautiful night. Valeria remained completely, utterly silent. The absolute last, highly hot tears silently rolling completely down her pale cheeks. She absolutely no longer vividly saw a highly arrogant, toxic CEO, but absolutely only a highly genuine, true man desperately attempting to miraculously piece completely back together the highly violently shattered pieces entirely of his broken heart. Julian, do you genuinely, truly know exactly what you literally just aggressively did? You will violently lose your absolute entire, massive elite career completely in massive London, Valeria whispered incredibly softly. Do absolutely not violently worry, Valeria. I successfully possess these highly strong hands. I successfully possess this highly brilliant brain. I will beautifully start completely from absolute scratch, completely right perfectly here, entirely, in beautiful Sevilla. If you graciously permit me, I will absolutely not return directly to massive New York, nor directly to massive London. I will completely move my highly massive corporate headquarters perfectly here, or I will simply happily be a highly normal, loving father the absolute very next morning, completely on highly magical Christmas Day. Julian absolutely did not confidently appear completely with highly extravagant, expensive gifts, completely from the highly elite, duty-free shop. Instead, he smoothly borrowed the highly old, vintage bicycle entirely of Valeria's great-grandfather, safely tying a highly small, simple gift bag directly to the back. He had aggressively stayed completely awake the entire agonizing night, meticulously, highly carefully carving a highly small, beautiful wooden bicycle entirely for Matteo, completely with a highly simple piece entirely of scrap wood, completely from Sophia's dusty storage room, and beautifully drawing a highly creative, colorful comic entirely about a brave father frantically searching entirely for a highly precious treasure exclusively for Luna. Julian gave up 50 million euros for his family. Do you think you could make a sacrifice like that for love? Tell us below. The shadow of London strikes back. The highly beautiful, perfect piece entirely of the magical Christmas was brutally, violently shattered, exactly when a highly official, stern messenger confidently arrived directly at Doña Sofia's heavy door. He absolutely did not highly generously bring a beautiful gift, but a highly massive federal lawsuit. Veronica Santander had absolutely not remained completely idle, completely with her arms highly arrogantly crossed. She was highly toxically, maliciously alleging highly severe mental incapacity and highly catastrophic, massive abandonment entirely of elite fiduciary duties, aggressively demanding a highly massive multi-million euro compensation that would completely violently leave Julian entirely in absolute total ruin. She highly aggressively wants my massive head perfectly on a highly silver platter, Julian stated, intensely reading the highly complex, toxic legal documents. She desperately wants to highly maliciously prove that I have completely, violently gone completely insane, entirely over a highly pathetic family fantasy entirely to successfully keep the absolute entirely of the massive company. Valeria gently took the heavy papers and meticulously read them completely, with the highly absolute precision entirely of absolutely someone who is highly accustomed entirely to flawlessly managing highly critical emergencies entirely in a highly stressful hospital. Her beautiful face violently hardened. She toxically believes that we are officially your highly pathetic weakness, Julian. She arrogantly thinks that highly maliciously using us exactly as a highly toxic argument will violently force you to completely back, completely down. But she absolutely does not completely know that I am officially a highly trained nurse. I profoundly know exactly what it truly means to violently fight completely against highly catastrophic death and against highly agonizing pain. If she desperately wants a highly explosive, massive war, we will generously give her exactly one. Valeria was absolutely not the exact same highly terrified young girl completely from exactly 3 agonizing years completely ago. She aggressively contacted highly loyal, former elite clients entirely of Julian, who highly profoundly respected him, and aggressively began to meticulously organize a highly impenetrable, massive defense, flawlessly based entirely on absolute integrity. Absolutely not entirely on highly cold numbers, while Julian happily learned exactly how to be a highly present father. Flawlessly changing dirty diapers, happily learning to beautifully cook highly traditional stews completely with Doña Sofia, and enthusiastically taking the innocent children directly to the local park. Valeria miraculously became his highly silent, brilliant strategist. The gift of truth, one beautiful afternoon, exactly as Julian enthusiastically played highly competitive soccer, completely with Matteo, entirely in the highly busy plaza. A highly aggressive group, entirely of toxic photographers, violently appeared. They desperately wanted the highly lucrative toxic photo, entirely of the highly humiliated, fallen millionaire, Julian. Entirely. Instead, entirely of cowardly hiding completely behind highly massive bodyguards that he absolutely no longer possessed. Gently took Matteo completely by his tiny hand and confidently walked directly toward them. "Do you desperately want a highly lucrative photo?" Julian asked incredibly calmly. "Highly aggressively take exactly this one. A highly proud man who is finally, truly, completely rich. entirely because he flawlessly holds his biological son completely by the tiny hand. Explicitly tell massive London that Julian de la Riva absolutely is not completely insane. He has simply miraculously completely woken up. Upon safely arriving completely home, Julian miraculously found Valeria meticulously reviewing highly old, completely forgotten emails. She had highly successfully found a highly critical, massive piece entirely of highly damning evidence. A highly toxic, official email entirely from Veronica, completely from exactly 3 agonizing years, completely ago. Exactly where she highly maliciously, explicitly admitted entirely to actively, deliberately blocking absolutely all entirely of Valeria's highly frantic calls directly to Julian's elite office, entirely on absolute purpose. She highly maliciously, violently separated us completely on absolute purpose, Julian, Valeria whispered incredibly softly, completely, with her beautiful eyes, violently misting completely over. She profoundly, explicitly knew that I was heavily pregnant. The highly blinding, massive fury that violently ran completely through Julian was incredibly freezing and highly lethal. Exactly now, he absolutely wasn't entirely just violently fighting completely for his absolute financial freedom, but entirely for the highly absolute justice, entirely of exactly 3 agonizing years, entirely of highly precious life, maliciously, violently stolen. The trial, the testimony, no one expected. The highly imposing palace of justice entirely in massive Madrid confidently stood incredibly highly imposing, highly freezing cold, and utterly gray. Julian de la Riva confidently walked completely through the highly polished corridors, completely with a highly massive, absolute security that absolutely did not completely come entirely from his highly bespoke suit. This highly specific time, a highly simple, highly modest model, but entirely from the highly beautiful, incredibly strong woman who confidently walked perfectly right, completely by his side. Valeria flawlessly dressed completely with a highly sober, absolute elegance, securely carrying entirely in her simple bag the expensive laptop completely with the highly damning explosive email that would completely, violently change the absolute destiny entirely of absolutely everyone. Veronica Santander highly arrogantly waited entirely in the massive courtroom, heavily surrounded entirely by the absolute most highly expensive, elite corporate lawyers entirely in massive Europe. Upon vividly seeing the highly confident couple confidently enter, she let out a highly toxic, smug smile. "You are absolutely still completely on highly safe time, Julian," Veronica violently whispered, exactly as they confidently passed completely by her side. "Aggressively sign the highly official transfer entirely of the massive company, and I will highly generously let you peacefully return directly to your highly pathetic, tiny little dollhouse, entirely in Sevilla, completely with your highly pathetic children. If you stubbornly move completely forward, I will violently sink you so incredibly deep that you absolutely won't even be highly physically capable entirely of actively paying completely for the cheap diapers entirely of those pathetic children." Julian absolutely did not actively stop. He smoothly turned completely around, intensely looked directly, deeply entirely, into her highly toxic eyes, and softly replied, "I absolutely no longer possess absolutely any blinding fear entirely of massive, total ruin, Veronica, because I was absolutely already completely in highly absolute spiritual ruin entirely for exactly 3 agonizing years, And you were exactly the highly toxic monster who maliciously, actively kept me perfectly there. Today, the absolute brutal truth confidently comes completely to absolute light. The massive, highly explosive trial violently began, completely with the highly ferocious, aggressive attacks, entirely of Veronica's highly expensive lawyers, desperately attempting to highly maliciously paint Julian exactly as a highly unstable, highly erratic man who had ruthlessly abandoned his highly critical responsibilities completely for a highly pathetic romantic impulse. But then, it was officially the highly anticipated turn entirely of the massive defense. Valeria confidently took the heavy stand. With a highly clear, incredibly firm voice, she passionately related her highly massive, agonizing struggle exactly as a highly exhausted single mother. But significantly more importantly, the highly systematic, toxic manipulation she highly brutally suffered. For exactly 3 agonizing years, I genuinely, truly thought that the biological father entirely of my innocent children had highly ruthlessly despised me, Valeria stated firmly, intensely looking directly at the stern judge. But the absolute, highly terrifying reality is that there absolutely was a highly toxic black hand that maliciously intercepted absolutely all my highly desperate letters, that actively blocked absolutely all my highly frantic calls, and that highly toxically made me physically feel exactly like I was completely, utterly worthless. That highly toxic, malicious hand is actively sitting right perfectly here, entirely in this massive room. Valeria highly proudly presented the highly damning, explosive email. The heavy silence entirely in the massive courtroom was completely, utterly absolute. Veronica's highly expensive lawyers frantically attempted to highly aggressively challenge it. But the highly official, time-stamped evidence was completely, undeniably irrefutable. Veronica's highly arrogant face violently went completely from highly toxic arrogance directly to pure, unadulterated panic entirely, in a highly specific matter, entirely of mere seconds. "It is a highly malicious, highly fake setup," Veronica violently screamed, completely losing her highly polished composure. She absolutely only highly desperately wants his massive money. "No, Veronica," Julian smoothly intervened completely from his comfortable seat. "She absolutely does not fiercely want my massive money. In absolute, highly verifiable fact, she is the absolute only massive reason exactly why today I absolutely do not fiercely care a single bit entirely about violently losing it. Your Honor, I highly voluntarily, completely legally renounce absolutely all my highly massive assets entirely in massive London. But I highly aggressively demand that absolute, total justice be flawlessly served entirely for the highly massive, toxic emotional fraud and the highly psychological manipulation entirely, of which we were highly violently victims. Veronica's evil plan was finally exposed. Do you think she got the karma she deserved? Tell us below. The return to what matters. After agonizing hours entirely of highly intense deliberation, the stern judge flawlessly dictated a highly historic, massive sentence. Veronica was completely, violently removed entirely from the highly elite management entirely of the massive company, completely for highly unethical, highly toxic conduct, and massive, deliberate fraud. And although Julian highly voluntarily lost a highly massive, significant part entirely of his massive fortune, entirely in the highly complex liquidation process, he miraculously recovered the absolute, most highly valuable, massive things. His absolute, pristine name, and his absolute, total, freedom. Weeks significantly later, completely back, entirely, in the highly small, beautiful cafe that Julian and Valeria happily opened completely together, entirely in the highly beating heart, entirely of Triana. Pure life, physically, felt incredibly different. There were absolutely no highly expensive chauffeurs, absolutely no highly luxurious, five-star hotels. But there was absolute pure laughter. Julian was happily behind the highly clean counter, meticulously preparing a highly delicious coffee, completely with the exact same, highly absolute precision, completely with which he highly previously, aggressively analyzed highly complex stock charts. Matteo and Luna enthusiastically scurried completely around the highly cozy establishment. Exactly now beautifully named Café Esperanza. Do you absolutely ever violently regret absolutely not actively being the highly powerful man entirely of the massive millions? Valeria softly asked, lovingly hugging him completely from directly behind, exactly as the beautiful sun, entirely of Sevilla, flawlessly set perfectly over the massive Guadalquivir River. Julian smoothly turned completely around, passionately kissed her, and then intensely looked directly at his beautiful children. Valeria, those highly massive 50 million were absolutely an incredibly toxic, highly gilded prison. Right perfectly here, entirely in this highly small, beautiful cafe, completely with absolutely you. I am officially the absolute, wealthiest massive man, entirely in the entire, massive world. I have successfully learned that absolute true success is absolutely not toxically measured entirely by exactly what you highly pathetically possess, entirely in the massive bank, but entirely by exactly who eagerly waits completely for you, perfectly at home, entirely at the absolute and entirely of the highly exhausting day. Absolutely nothing is completely forever, entirely except absolute pure love. The temptation of gold. Exactly 6 beautiful months have successfully passed completely since the stern judge flawlessly dictated the highly final sentence. Café Esperanza, securely situated entirely on a highly sunny, beautiful corner entirely of Triana, has successfully, miraculously, become the highly beating heart, entirely of the quiet neighborhood. Julian de la Riva absolutely no longer flawlessly wears highly expensive silk ties. Exactly now, he happily wears a highly simple, cheap apron, heavily stained completely with dark coffee, and a highly massive, radiant smile that he absolutely never, ever possessed entirely in his highly stressful years, exactly as a terrifying CEO. Valeria, although absolutely still actively working highly flexible part-time shifts, exactly as a highly dedicated nurse, is officially the absolute soul entirely of the highly successful business, meticulously organizing absolutely every single, tiny detail, completely with the exact same, highly flawless precision, completely with which she miraculously saved fragile lives. Matteo and Luna, exactly 3 young years old, are the highly adorable little kings entirely of the cozy place. Matteo actively possesses a highly cute obsession completely with enthusiastically helping his loving father meticulously clean the small tables. Entirely, while Luna happily sits completely with the highly loyal, regular customers to enthusiastically tell them highly imaginative, beautiful, invented stories. Pure life is incredibly simple. It is incredibly real. And entirely for the absolute first time, it is completely, utterly happy. However, exactly one highly sunny afternoon, entirely in beautiful June, a highly elegant, highly expensive man, completely with a highly expensive leather briefcase, confidently entered the quiet cafe. He absolutely wasn't actively looking entirely for a highly delicious cortado. He was actively looking completely for Julian. It was Rodrigo, the highly ambitious former elite partner entirely of Julian, entirely in the massive company, completely in massive New York. Julian, I have absolutely been frantically searching completely for you entirely, throughout absolutely all entirely of massive Spain, Rodrigo stated, intensely looking completely with massive, pure astonishment entirely at the highly small, modest establishment. I literally cannot genuinely believe that the highly terrifying man who completely, utterly dominated massive Wall Street is exactly now highly pathetically serving cheap toast, completely with simple tomato. Rodrigo absolutely did not actively come completely with highly toxic, bad intentions. He aggressively brought a highly massive, explosive offer. The highly powerful board of directors, completely after the highly catastrophic scandal entirely of Veronica, had profoundly realized that Julian was officially the absolute, only highly brilliant brain, completely capable entirely of miraculously saving the highly massive international merger. They were highly aggressively offering him to confidently return exactly as the absolute, highly powerful executive president, completely with a highly massive, astronomical salary, entirely of exactly 10 million a year, and the highly flexible possibility entirely of actively working completely remotely, entirely from massive Madrid. It is your highly massive ultimate opportunity entirely to flawlessly recover your massive empire, Julian. You can successfully give Valeria and the innocent children a highly luxurious life entirely of massive palaces. Absolutely not entirely of highly pathetic neighborhood cafes, Rodrigo aggressively insisted. Julian intensely looked directly at Valeria, who was actively on the absolute other side entirely of the busy counter, intensely observing the highly tense scene completely with a highly apparent calm, but completely with her massive heart violently clutched completely in her soft fist. She absolutely said nothing. She profoundly knew that exactly this was the absolute, ultimate, definitive test entirely for Julian. Was his absolute pure love entirely for them simply a highly temporary phase entirely of massive redemption? Or a highly profound, absolute commitment entirely for absolute life? That exact night, entirely on the highly small, quiet porch, entirely of their cozy house, the heavy silence was incredibly dense. Do you desperately want me to actively accept it, Valeria? Julian softly asked, actively breaking the freezing ice. With that highly massive amount entirely of money, you could highly easily, completely stop actively working highly exhausting double shifts entirely at the massive hospital. The innocent children would absolutely possess the absolute best highly elite schools entirely in the massive world. The innocent children absolutely already successfully possess the absolute best highly loving father entirely in the massive world. Right exactly now, Julian, she warmly replied, gently taking his strong hand. Exactly whatever you fiercely decide, I will absolutely, fiercely support it. But deeply remember exactly why we miraculously found absolutely each other entirely on that highly massive airplane. It absolutely wasn't entirely because completely of the massive money. It was entirely because your highly toxic previous life was actively, violently killing you completely on the inside. Julian has the chance to get 10 million a year and his empire back. Do you think he will take the offer? Share your thoughts below. The twist of destiny. Before Julian could highly successfully make a highly massive decision, highly tragic tragedy violently brushed completely against the beautiful family. Doña Sofia, the highly loving grandmother who was the absolute, unshakable pillar entirely of Valeria, completely during her highly agonizing loneliness, violently suffered a highly sudden fainting spell entirely in the beautiful garden. At the massive hospital, the highly elite doctors solemnly confirmed that she desperately, highly urgently needed a highly complex, incredibly expensive, highly urgent heart surgery. Absolutely something that the highly basic, pathetic insurance absolutely did not completely cover. And that the highly modest savings entirely from the small cafe absolutely could not successfully reach entirely to rapidly pay completely immediately. Julian violently saw himself completely at a highly cruel, massive crossroads. He legally possessed the highly massive offer entirely from Rodrigo, perfectly on the small table. Actively accepting explicitly meant miraculously saving grandmother Sofia completely, without a single ounce entirely of hesitation. But it absolutely also explicitly meant violently returning directly to the highly toxic world that miraculously almost completely destroyed him. "I will absolutely accept the massive offer," Julian stated firmly, entirely, in the highly sterile waiting room entirely of the massive hospital, intensely looking directly into Valeria's beautiful eyes. But absolutely not exactly as the executive president. "I will highly legally sell my absolute final reserve shares directly to Rodrigo, entirely to successfully pay completely for the highly expensive surgery entirely of Sofia. I will absolutely, permanently stay right perfectly here. Valeria, if I actively have to fiercely choose completely between actively being a highly terrifying magnate or actively being the true man who fiercely takes absolute care entirely of this beautiful family, I fiercely choose entirely to absolutely be the man. I absolutely do not desperately need the highly arrogant position. I absolutely only desperately need the highly profound value entirely of exactly what I have absolutely already beautifully built, completely, with you. The love that heals everything. The highly complex, massive operation entirely of Doña Sofia was an absolute, highly resounding, flawless success. The massive money that Julian highly successfully obtained, completely by actively selling his absolute, final shares absolutely did not entirely just flawlessly cover the absolute, best highly elite surgeons entirely in massive Spain, but absolutely also a highly luxurious, elite post-operative recovery treatment. Julian absolutely did not violently separate completely from the massive hospital, highly exhaustedly sleeping entirely in incredibly uncomfortable, cheap chairs, and highly gratefully bringing hot coffee directly to the highly exhausted nurses, flawlessly demonstrating that his highly massive commitment was absolutely not entirely just highly financial, but incredibly profoundly human. When Doña Sofia finally, beautifully woke completely up and highly emotionally learned entirely of exactly what Julian had selflessly done, violently renouncing his highly triumphant massive return directly to the absolute top, entirely of the massive corporate world, entirely to miraculously save her. Her highly piercing green eyes, highly previously, incredibly severe, violently filled completely with highly emotional hot tears. "Come directly here, my beautiful son," Sofia stated incredibly softly, with a highly weak but incredibly firm voice, lovingly calling him son entirely for the absolute first time. I was completely catastrophically wrong entirely about you. You are absolutely not a highly toxic man, entirely of cold money. You are a highly honorable, true man, entirely of your absolute word. Thank you so incredibly much, entirely, for miraculously returning my beautiful life completely to me. Entirely, to vividly see my beautiful great-grandchildren happily grow completely up. Julian gently took her soft hand, profoundly feeling that exactly that highly profound, absolute recognition was absolutely worth significantly more than absolutely any highly massive, elite bonus entirely from massive Wall Street. But exactly while beautiful peace miraculously returned completely to the beautiful family, Valeria heavily kept a highly unusual, mysterious silence. The secret revealed weeks significantly later. Completely with Doña Sofia absolutely already, happily installed completely back, entirely in her beautiful garden, entirely in Triana. Valeria and Julian were peacefully walking completely along the highly beautiful shore, entirely of the massive Guadalquivir River, completely under the beautiful bright moonlight. The identical twins had happily stayed deeply sleeping completely with the loving grandmother. Julian, you have selflessly sacrificed so incredibly much, entirely for us, Valeria softly began, completely stopping perfectly in front, entirely of the highly beautiful Torre del Oro. You legally sold your massive company. You fiercely rejected massive millions. And you have beautifully, miraculously become a highly humble, neighborhood man, completely out, entirely of pure love. But there is absolutely something massive that I absolutely have to explicitly tell you. Absolutely something highly incredible I horrifyingly discovered exactly a few short days completely ago. Julian intensely looked directly at her completely with massive worry. Is absolutely something highly catastrophic actively wrong, Valeria? Is it entirely about the fragile health entirely of Sophia? Valeria gently took Julian's strong hand and incredibly softly placed it perfectly completely over her absolute own flat belly. A highly radiant, beautiful smile flawlessly illuminated her highly exhausted face. It is absolutely nothing highly wrong. It is simply that Matteo and Luna are actively going to happily possess a beautiful sibling. I am officially heavily pregnant, Julian. Julian completely, utterly lost, absolutely all his heavy breath. Time physically seemed to completely, violently stop. Exactly, just exactly like that highly magical day entirely on the massive airplane. But this highly specific time, there was absolutely zero blinding fear, absolutely zero highly toxic secrets, absolutely zero highly narrow economy class aisles violently separating them. Truly? He whispered incredibly softly, enthusiastically lifting her completely into the thin air and happily spinning her completely around exactly as he loudly, beautifully laughed. Absolutely another beautiful one. This highly specific time, I will absolutely be right perfectly there, completely from the absolute, very first, microscopic second. Valeria, I will absolutely not violently miss a single highly emotional ultrasound, nor a single highly tiny kick. The final destination, Cafe Esperanza. The highly massive, beautiful news entirely of the brand new pregnancy was the absolute, highly definitive seal entirely of their beautiful brand new life. Julian fiercely decided that he absolutely no longer desperately wanted to actively be absolutely just the highly simple owner entirely of a quiet cafe. Highly inspired completely by the massive, absolute bravery entirely of Valeria, and the highly profound wisdom entirely of Sophia. He fiercely decided to beautifully use the highly small remaining capital he absolutely still possessed entirely to miraculously convert the Café Esperanza completely into a highly supportive, massive foundation. A highly beautiful place that absolutely did not entirely just happily serve delicious coffee, but absolutely also fiercely helped highly struggling single mothers and highly ambitious young entrepreneurs completely without massive resources, generously giving them the highly elite, advanced training that Julian exactly once highly arrogantly used, absolutely only entirely, for his absolute own highly toxic benefit. The magnate of Christmas Eve, exactly as the highly local media exactly now highly affectionately called him, had miraculously, beautifully become a highly true, genuine hero entirely of the beautiful community. Do you profoundly know exactly what is the absolute most highly ironic massive thing? Julian softly stated exactly one beautiful afternoon, exactly as they happily decorated the beautiful nursery entirely for the brand new baby. That exactly when I successfully possessed exactly 50 million euros, I profoundly felt exactly like I violently lacked absolutely everything. Exactly now that we literally barely actively possess exactly enough entirely to successfully pass the highly tight month and actively pay the highly heavy mortgage entirely of the small place. I profoundly feel exactly like I successfully possess the absolute, entire, massive world completely left over. Valeria kissed him passionately, profoundly knowing that the massive, beautiful circle had successfully, flawlessly closed. The highly terrifying flight entirely of that highly specific Christmas Eve absolutely did not entirely just miraculously take them directly to Sevilla. It beautifully, miraculously brought them completely, flawlessly back entirely to themselves. The philosophical conclusion. This highly explosive, beautiful story flawlessly teaches us highly profound, absolute lessons. 1. True fatherhood is absolute presence, absolutely not massive patrimony. A true father absolutely isn't toxically defined entirely by the highly arrogant last name he inherits, or the highly massive trust fund he maliciously deposits completely in a cold bank. Julian was a highly arrogant millionaire entirely in London, but a highly pathetic, emotional beggar. Absolutely only exactly when he was completely willing to violently get his massive hands dirty, meticulously carving wooden toys, lovingly curing scraped knees, did he miraculously become a highly true father. Lesson: an innocent child will absolutely never remember the highly expensive price entirely of their pathetic toys, but they will absolutely always remember exactly who was happily sitting entirely on the hard floor playing completely with them. 2. True success is an absolute decision. Absolutely not a bank balance. Julian violently had to completely lose exactly 50 million euros entirely to profoundly realize that he was completely, spiritually bankrupt. True success absolutely isn't the highly freezing top entirely of a massive skyscraper. It is the highly warm, absolute peace entirely of a beautiful home, exactly where there are absolutely zero highly toxic secrets. Lesson: sometimes you absolutely must violently renounce exactly what the highly toxic world toxically calls progress, entirely to miraculously recover exactly what your fragile heart beautifully calls home. 3. A mother's dignity is an absolute, unbreakable shield. Valeria flawlessly represents pure, unadulterated resilience. She absolutely did not pathetically seek Julian entirely for massive money. And absolutely, even exactly when he violently returned, she absolutely did not toxically accept him entirely for his highly expensive wallet. Her highly absolute demand was entirely for highly real, massive change. She flawlessly proved that actively being a struggling single mother absolutely isn't a highly pathetic weakness, but a highly massive source entirely of absolute power that miraculously allowed her to bravely face absolutely, even highly terrifying corporate sharks, exactly like Veronica. 4. True forgiveness is absolutely not forgetting. It is absolute liberation. Doña Sofia beautifully teaches us that actively forgiving absolutely does not explicitly mean highly toxically saying that exactly what violently happened was perfectly fine. It explicitly means fiercely deciding that the highly toxic past absolutely possesses zero massive power to violently ruin the beautiful future. 5. Highly toxic lies possess a highly strict expiration date. The highly catastrophic fall entirely of Veronica and the highly toxic empire entirely of lies flawlessly demonstrates that absolutely whatever is maliciously built entirely on highly toxic deception absolutely always violently collapses completely in the absolute end. 6. Absolute sacrifice is the true currency entirely of real love. Julian's absolute, highly final act, violently selling his absolute last massive shares entirely to miraculously save grandmother Sophia, was the highly definitive, absolute proof entirely of his highly massive transformation. Lesson: true love absolutely isn't highly toxically spoken. It is actively, fiercely, absolute true sacrifice is highly generously giving exactly what absolutely costs us the highly most massive amount to violently let completely go. What an absolutely incredible, breathtaking journey of true love and ultimate redemption. Which highly profound lesson deeply impacted you the absolute most? Do you genuinely believe that true love can truly change a person so incredibly much? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you absolutely loved this beautiful story of hope and family, please smash that like button. Generously share it with someone who deeply believes in second chances. And subscribe to the channel for more incredible, life-changing stories. See you in the next video.